In 2022, the West launched what they called the most comprehensive sanctions package in history against Russia. The goal? Cripple their economy and end the war in Ukraine. 3 years later, Russia's economy is still functioning and the war continues. So what happened? Today we're breaking down exactly how economic sanctions work, why they sometimes fail spectacularly, and what makes the difference between sanctions that change behavior and sanctions that just make headlines. Let's dive in.
How economic sanctions actually work. Part 1. The basics. When you hear the word sanctions, it might sound like some abstract diplomatic move, but in reality, it's one of the most powerful economic weapons in international politics. At its simplest, sanctions are economic penalties. They're restrictions one country or a coalition of countries imposes on another, not to start a war, but to change behavior without firing a single shot. Sanctions come in 3 main forms. First, trade sanctions. These are like closing the doors of commerce. A country is told, you can't buy or sell certain goods anymore. Think export bans on high-tech equipment or import bans on vital resources like oil and gas. For a trading nation, that's economic suffocation. Second, financial sanctions. This one hits the money pipeline. Banks get cut off, assets are frozen, and financial transactions suddenly stop flowing. Imagine waking up one day to find your country's access to international banking has been switched off. That's what a financial sanction feels like. And third, individual sanctions. These go after specific people, politicians, generals, or business elites. Their bank accounts abroad? Frozen. Their travel privileges? Gone. Their yachts in Monaco? Seized. It's personal pressure meant to make influential figures feel the cost of their government's actions. The next part we're going to be looking at is how this economic sanctions is supposed to work. The logic behind sanctions sounds straightforward, even elegant on paper. 1. Create economic pain. The sanctions make it harder to trade, invest, or access money. 2. That pain spreads through the economy. Businesses close, inflation rises, and living standards drop. Citizens get frustrated. 3. Pressure builds on the government. In theory, that government, wanting relief, changes its behavior to meet the sanctioning country's demands. 4. Sanctions are lifted, and normal trade resumes. It's like a form of economic blackmail, but done under the banner of diplomacy. The idea is simple. Hurt the economy, and you change the politics. The key mechanism is SWIFT. But the real power of modern sanctions isn't just in trade or travel bans, it's in the control of money itself. And at the heart of that control lies a system called SWIFT. SWIFT, short for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is basically the global messaging network that connects over 11,000 banks across more than 200 countries. It's what allows money to move securely between nations. When a country or a major bank is cut off from SWIFT, it's like being unplugged from the global financial system. You can still have money, but you can't move it internationally. You're isolated. That's why when Russia was partly disconnected from SWIFT in 2022, it was treated like a financial nuclear strike, one that left Moscow scrambling to find alternative systems. But here's the catch. Those alternatives are limited, fragmented, and nowhere near as powerful as SWIFT itself. In today's economy, losing SWIFT access isn't just a punishment, it's economic exile.
The big question is, when do sanctions work, and when don't they? That takes us to part 2. When sanctions work, and when they don't. So we're going to talk about these 2 points in sections A and B. For section A, when sanctions do work. Sanctions sound powerful, but here's the truth. They only work about 1/3 of the time. According to the Peterson Institute's landmark study, Economic Sanctions Reconsidered, roughly 34% of sanctions actually achieve their intended goals. That means in most cases, they fail. So when they do work, what makes the difference? First, the goals have to be clear and limited. If If you're trying to force a government to stop one specific action, like releasing detained citizens or halting a nuclear test, sanctions can be effective. But if the goal is to make a regime collapse or change leadership entirely, that's rarely successful. For example, when Iran faced renewed U.S. sanctions in 2018, the restrictions hit hard. Oil exports fell, inflation surged, and the economy shrank sharply between 2019 and 2020. The pressure forced Iran back to the negotiating table in past cases, a sign that targeted, coordinated sanctions can sometimes change behavior, at least temporarily. Second, sanctions bite hardest when many countries act together. That's called multilateral pressure. When the US, EU, Japan, and others coordinate, the target has nowhere to run. No alternate markets, no backup banks. This teamwork was key during some past nuclear non-proliferation efforts, where unity turned economic pressure into political leverage. And third, economic leverage matters. Sanctions from a country that dominates global trade or finance, like the US, carry real weight because of the dollar's central role. If you rely on US-linked systems, the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, can freeze you out instantly. That's economic power at a planetary scale.
Now let's enter one of the most crucial and interesting parts of this video: why sanctions fail. There are three main factors why sanctions fail. The first factor is the adaptation factor, the shock and the shift. When sanctions first hit, they're like an earthquake. Currencies crash, businesses panic, and governments scramble for footing. But here's the thing about nations: they adapt. The longer the sanctions stay, the smarter the workarounds become. Finding the loopholes. Cut off from global banking? Countries start building alternative payment systems. Can't use dollars? They trade in local currencies. Can't access SWIFT? They use barter deals or crypto transactions. Take Russia, for example. When Western sanctions tried to cripple its oil exports, Moscow didn't just fold. It rerouted its oil, quietly, through Indian refineries and Turkish intermediaries. The same oil that Europe banned still ended up in Europe, just with a new label and a higher price tag. And then there's the shadow tanker fleet. Hundreds of untraceable ships sailing under obscure flags, carrying oil across the oceans in defiance of sanctions. Every loophole closed spawns another one open. So the question becomes, if countries can adapt this fast, can sanctions ever truly isolate them? Next is the alliance problem. Sanctions need solidarity. Here's the dirty secret about sanctions: they only work when everyone plays along. It's like a global boycott. If even a few big players break ranks, the pressure collapses. That's exactly what happened with Russia. When the US and Europe imposed sweeping bans, China and India kept buying Russian oil. Lots of it. In fact, China-Russia trade didn't go down, it went up by more than 30% since 2022. The sanctions arbitrage game. What that creates is arbitrage, a kind of global loophole economy. Countries buy cheap Russian oil, refine it, and sell it back to the world at a profit. Sanctions meant to punish one country end up enriching another. And something new starts to happen. Sanctioned nations begin to band together. Iran sells drones to Russia. North Korea supplies ammunition. China builds trade bridges that bypass Western systems entirely. It's no longer one country being isolated, it's the birth of a parallel economic world. So now we face another question. If the world is splitting into two economic systems, who's really being isolated? Then, the boomerang effects. The cost nobody talks about. Here's the part often left out of political speeches. Sanctions don't just hurt the target, they boomerang back. When Europe sanctioned Russian energy, it wasn't Russia that froze first, it was Europe. Natural gas prices skyrocketed, factories shut down, inflation hit record highs. By 2023, Germany, the economic engine of Europe, was slipping into a mild industrial recession largely because of energy costs.
And it didn't stop there. Food prices rose globally as supply chains fractured. Developing countries faced fertilizer shortages and rising debt. Meanwhile, Western exporters lost billions in lost markets, and voters at home started feeling the squeeze. The political pressure. That's when the political cost sets in. Citizens ask, why are we paying the price for policies that aren't even working? Governments begin to wobble under domestic pressure. Calls for sanction relief grow louder. And the target country, the one supposed to be cornered, realizes time might actually be on its side. So the paradox is this: the longer sanctions drag on, the more they strengthen the target's ability to adapt and weaken the unity of those imposing them. What started as a show of economic strength turns into a test of political endurance. And that leads us to the final question. If sanctions are losing their edge, what comes next in the new age of economic warfare?
The key takeaway. So, when do sanctions really work? When the goals are clear, when the world acts together, and when the pain hits the decision makers, not the powerless. But when those conditions break down, sanctions become what experts like Nicholas Mulder call the economic weapon that misfires. They create shockwaves, but not always change.
Part 4, the future of economic warfare. Imagine a world where countries don't just fight with weapons, but with money, code, and data. That's the new battlefield, and it's evolving fast. First on our list to prove this point is the de-dollarization efforts. For decades, the US dollar has been the backbone of global trade. Every oil deal, every international loan, almost everything flowed through the dollar. And that made US sanctions extremely powerful. Cut a country off from dollar transactions, and you essentially lock it out of the global economy. But now, countries are trying to change that. Enter BRICS, a coalition of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They're developing alternative payment systems, trying to reduce their reliance on the dollar. Russia now trades oil with India in rupees. China signs agreements to settle trade in yuan. Even smaller nations are exploring digital currencies, state-backed digital money that might one day bypass the US-controlled systems entirely. It's like a financial rebellion, a group of countries trying to escape the dollar's gravity. It hasn't replaced the dollar yet, but the seeds have been planted. 2. Technology's role, cryptocurrencies and AI. Then there's technology. When cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin first emerged, some thought they'd make sanctions useless, an untraceable way to move money across borders. And to some extent, they did complicate things. North Korea, for instance, has used crypto hacks and digital wallets to dodge restrictions. But here's the twist. Blockchain is transparent. Every transaction leaves a digital footprint. So while crypto made evasion easier at first, it also gave investigators new tools to track hidden money trails. In other words, technology is arming both sides, the evaders and the enforcers. 3. Sanctions fatigue. But even the most powerful weapon loses its edge if overused. That's the problem facing the US today. With more than 10,000 entities and individuals under American sanctions, the label sanctions superpower is starting to sound like a double-edged sword. Each new round of sanctions pushes more countries to look for ways out of the US-dominated system. Economists call this sanctions fatigue, when allies and rivals alike start questioning whether constant economic punishment still works, or if it's simply pushing the world towards fragmentation. So the future of economic warfare isn't just about who has the biggest economy. It's about who controls the connections, payment networks, digital currencies, and data flows. And as those connections evolve, one thing is clear: sanctions as we know them are changing. The next battles won't just be fought in boardrooms or embassies, but in algorithms, blockchain ledgers, and digital currencies that are quietly redrawing the map of global power.
So here's the bottom line. Economic sanctions are powerful weapons, but they're not magic. They work best when everyone participates, goals are realistic, and they're part of a broader strategy. The Russia sanctions haven't collapsed the economy overnight, but they've cost Russia hundreds of billions and complicated their military capabilities. Iran's economy has been devastated, but the regime adapted. Understanding these mechanisms is crucial because economic warfare is only going to intensify. In future videos, we'll explore specific sanction battles, the rise of alternative systems, and whether the dollar's dominance is really at risk. Now the big question: are we entering a world where economic sanctions become less effective as countries build alternative systems?
Kindly share your thoughts on this matter, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel as we look forward to seeing you on our next video.